Hello and welcome to Analyse This, Mental Health in Film and TV. I am your host, Dr. Boo, clinical psychologist. Each week myself and a guest take a look at a film or series and consider the way mental health, neurodiversity and therapy are portrayed. Today I'm joined by Dr. Gardner, another clinical psychologist, to talk about the film Inside Out.
I'm joy. This is sadness. That's anger.
What?
This is disgust. And that's fear. We're Riley's emotions. These are Riley's memories. They're mostly happy, you'll notice, not to brag.
I wanted to maybe hold one.
What happened? Sadness?
She did something to the memory.
Is everything okay? I don't know.
Take it back, Joy.
Trying. Joy, no,
Let
wait.
go.
The core memories. Can I say that curse word now?
Inside Out is a much-loved film with a cute concept of how emotions, memories and personalities work. But is it an accurate representation? How might it be helpful to us in our therapy work? And keep listening to find out why Dr. Cat thinks there's a bit of a dark side to joy. I'm here today with Dr. Cat Gardner of Green Shoot Psychology and also of In Mind Consulting. And thank you so much for joining us today, Cat.
Thank you, Dr. Boo. It's a pleasure to be here.
And actually, I'm going to call you Dr. Cat because that is how I think of you outside of talking to you as a friend. Dr. Cat in psychology mode. Tell us a little bit about yourself in the psychology world. How do you position yourself? What kind of approaches do you take? What kind of clients do you tend to work with?
Well, I work with quite a range of clients, from children and adolescents, often struggling with their emotions, and that then having an impact on how they're doing in their social world or how they're getting on in their families. And I also work with adults, often around struggling with emotions, around how that impacts you at work, how you show up in your family, how you're able to live the life that you want to live when you've got this whole tricky thing in your brain that impacts you, and how being human can make living life pretty tricky sometimes.
Yes, our tricky brains, they are. And these emotions. So this is what we're talking about today.
Absolutely.
Inside Out.
Yeah, doing more as well in terms of just trying to, because I think it's interesting in terms of stepping a bit more into the corporate space and how actually it's not just us as individuals, it's us as whether it's groups, communities, organizations, and how we think about people and hold them in mind and hold their emotional and psychological needs in mind, and how that impacts every facet of life, really.
Absolutely. And that's really, really good because so Dr. Cat and I, along with our lovely colleagues, Dr. Rosie and Dr. Kendall, have set up In Mind Consulting. And we are a group of registered psychologists. And this is what we do. We talk to companies about creating resilience and psychological well-being in the workplace. And we look at that from a real evidence-based perspective. But one of the really big things that we end up talking about is how our emotions, our tricky brains, actually, they come into work. We don't leave them behind. We don't say, actually, I'm in work mode now. I don't need to worry about, anger and fear. That just doesn't come into it. Of course it does. So I think it'd be really interesting to kind of keep that at the back of our minds while we talk about this film, Inside Out, which is a little old now, to be honest. They've released a few more since this one, but quite a few people have said to me, you haven't done Inside Out yet. Why haven't you done Inside Out? Because it really is a classic one, especially for psychologists, because it's a really good portrayal of emotions, and it can be really, really useful in a therapeutic setting to kind of bring in narrative approach to your emotions as little things, and it really helps. So just to give a really brief synopsis for anybody who for some reason has missed this film, usually happy girl, we meet the emotions controlling Riley, who's 11. She's got joy running the show in her head most of the time. And at the console in her brain, there's also sadness, fear, disgust, and anger. And depending on who is in control of this console tends to determine what sort of reactions she's going to have to events. So first of all, Joy tries to keep sadness away from everything. In fact, at one point, she draws this little circle around sadness that she's not allowed out of. mainly to stop sadness having any control or touching Riley's core memories, which are these little marbles. And as a result, Riley is this resilient, happy child, apparently. But what Joy doesn't seem to understand is that it's okay to be sad. And some memories that make us happy can also make us sad. And in fact, some of these core memories are actually sad memories. So life changes with this series of events where Joy is doing her best to keep sadness away from everything. And that results actually in the loss of sadness and joy from Riley's sort of emotional console. And they disappear off into her long-term memory. And these adventures of joy and sadness take them on this journey through imagination land and abstract thought and deep into the subconscious where they put the troublemakers, which I love.
It's a great line.
Meeting along the way figures from her pre-operational stage, which is really cool too. But that leaves anger, disgust, and fear in charge of the console, which leads Riley to feel predominantly sort of angry, apathy. Basically, I found using this in therapy can be really, really helpful for both children and adults, actually, to consider their emotions to be like these little guys. So, oh, okay, this is fear at the controls again, is actually a lot more helpful, I think, than saying, I'm scared. I can't, I am scared. It's actually, okay, no, that is a feeling of fear. It's that kind of pushing it away, isn't it? And stepping back and naming it and observing it.
Yep. Absolutely. And it's really interesting, actually. I did some narrative therapy training. It was when you train to be a clinical psychologist, it's a really interesting time because you have 3 years and you get, certainly in the course I went to in Exeter, you get exposed to lots of different therapeutic ways of approaching psychological distress. And models view things like emotions and thoughts and behavior differently, how they describe them, how they talk about them, and how they advise therapists how best to interact with someone who's experiencing difficulties because of them. And the idea of personifying your emotions spreads across lots of different psychological forms of therapy. And so did some narrative therapy training while I was still a trainee and loved it. And so much of that is actually about our use of language and how we can we develop these narratives, these stories that we tell ourselves. So the story about fear could be, I am afraid, which might quite quickly leap to, I am a fearful person. Fear has got hold of me. I can't cope. I can't manage. As opposed to the narrative of what's fear? What is fear like? Can we make it into a little person or a little monster or a little thing? What color is it? What size is it? Can we give it a shape, a form, a texture? Can we look at the impact of it on your life? What does it want for you? Does it want positive things for you or bad things for you? And it's been really interesting as a journey in terms of using this technique. And I mean, kids often get it straight away because the idea of using their creative minds to describe things, it's just part of their language. But for adults as well, although sometimes there is this slight look in their eye when you're like, what color is it? What shape would it be? But very quickly, once people, I think, loosen up around that, you develop these amazing descriptions. And I remember working with someone years ago who loved Marvel, and I can only imagine that he's had like the best last 15 years in terms of his cinematography viewing, because he loved Marvel when it was mostly comics and the old school cartoons that some of us grew up watching. But I remember he had OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and so he used to describe it as Loki, the trickster, who was trying to tell him he had to wash his hands. He had to turn that light switch on and off 5 times before leaving the house. Otherwise, he would get really sick. His dad would get really sick. And by being able to create that distance, that separation, it was Loki, the trickster, trying to trick him. It was really, really helpful for him. And I use a lot of ACT now, acceptance and commitment therapy, in my work. And ACT also has this real this love of personification and description and narrative and understanding. Well, what is it? How could you describe it? What's it look like? What's it feel like? Where do you experience it in your body? There's lots of these ways of personifying and understanding something that helps create that bit of psychological distance that actually ultimately gives us a space to move in, a space to remember we have efficacy, we can change, even sometimes only small changes when we're feeling really stuck, but we can make changes even in these spaces.
Yeah. And the way that acceptance and commitment therapy works as well with regards to thanking your brain, which is one of my favorite things, because actually what you can then do is you can picture all these little things at the console just trying their best,
Yes.
anxiety trying its best to protect, or anger trying its best to keep you safe and stand up for your rights when threatened, and all these kinds of things, you can say, okay, I can see you, little guys. Thank you for what you're
Yeah.
trying to do.
Yep, and I think Inside Out, the writers did that beautifully, and I mean they say that they worked alongside psychologists in developing it, and you can see it because actually that capacity that they're very clear on, that that fear is there to keep Riley safe, that disgust is there to keep Riley from being poisoned physically and socially, which I thought
Yes.
is brilliant because actually we are social creatures, and that we've got this hardwired desire and need to be part of the group and not to muck it up, and that could be very risky for us. And I love the fact that anger cares very deeply about things being fair. And that's actually, I think, a really helpful reframe as well, because I think anger can be, we'll probably talk about this later, I imagine, as well, but I think we have such strong socialization into our emotions, and anger can be seen as this really negative. But as you said, it's about, if you care very deeply about being fair, then anger might be the fuel that you need to stand up for yourself, stand up for somebody else, to become an activist in a societal way against something that isn't right. So actually, we need anger as well. And I love the fact that they kind of say that Joy says, "Sadness, I'm not actually sure what she does," because that's the story arc for Joy, is that she starts the movie, she doesn't know why Sadness is there. And I mean, I've watched the movie quite a lot of times, but I took my homework prep for the podcast. I know you know me, you know this would be very much part of my personality. Took it very seriously. So me and the kids rewatched it last week, and I was really struck by this very first scene. And Joy it comes into being in Riley's brain, and there's this really cute baby who's doing that funny baby mouthy stuff, and Joy appears in this dark room, and she talks about how that it was amazing, she felt like she was with Riley forever, but actually it was 15 seconds before Sadness comes in, and then Sadness appears, they introduce each other. Sadness presses that very limited console because it's very simple, because Riley's a baby, you literally just press it and it's cause and effect. And then Joy, when Riley starts crying, Joy immediately says, I'll let me just fix it. And I think, again, we have this such an impulse, don't we, that we need to fix difficult or negative emotions, how difficult it is for us to sit with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's the thing that it felt to me on first looking at it that potentially it does look like there's almost weighted towards what's considered to be negative emotions, because we are brought up, as you say, to believe that there are positive emotions and negative emotions. Joy is positive, sadness is negative. And it's interesting that when you look at kind of what emotions could have been left out, what other emotions they could have used, because obviously we're not limited to just those emotions.
We have more complex characters living up there.
But basic emotion theory proposes that we do have this limited number of sort of fear, anger, joy, sadness are biologically and psychologically basic emotions. And they're kind of preserved because they're essential. They're essential to evolution and adaptation. So there's proposals of possibly 8 emotions. I think Robert Plutchik says that there's anger, fear, sadness, disgust, surprise, anticipation, trust, and joy. And Ekman as well, who I think was one of the psychologists that helped in Inside Out, also proposed 7, which also included contempt and disgust as 2 separate ones, which I think is interesting, and surprise. So I kind of think it's a little bit sad that there isn't surprise, because actually I think, especially as a baby, there's a lot of surprise. It's kind of everything is new, everything is a surprise, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a frightening thing or an angry making thing or a joyful thing. It is just a thing. It's an emotion of its own. It's like, oh gosh. And then you decide what you're going to do with it. Then you can decide who's going to get to the console next. It's a surprise, can be there first.
If anyone ever needs cheering up, if you look on YouTube for babies surprised going through tunnels, there are some amazing YouTube videos of people who have videoed their baby going in a car, traveling from light to dark. And the look of surprise, bewilderment and wonder on these babies' faces is hilarious. It's a great example of that.
Oh, great. I love that. I'll have to look that up. So it then made me think, okay, so are these actually quite negative emotions? Because what we've ended up with is taking out surprise as, does that mean that we've got the sadness, disgust, anger, and fear, and then you've got joy? But actually, the way that you've talked about it, I think, is more that that they all have a role, and they're not. Anxiety isn't necessarily negative. Fear isn't necessarily a negative thing. In fact, sometimes fear can be quite a positive thing. We pop ourselves onto a roller coaster. We can feel both fear and joy at the same time, which is something I think Joy then learns, right? As the time
Yes.
goes by, she learns that she can share the console, as
Yeah.
the adults do in their little brains. The consoles are bigger. Everybody has space.
Absolutely. And everyone's sitting down as well, which is, again, something I think very, very interesting how because you see as the film progresses, you see into mum's head and dad's head. The out reel is hilarious because you see into dogs, cats, teenage boys' heads as well. But that's a whole other matter. But I think you're absolutely right, because I think I quite frequently work with people for whom fear or anxiety is a big part of the reason why they're seeking therapeutic support at that time. And my sort of the starting blocks of those therapy sessions are exploring what is the biological basis for fear and I know we're still understanding a lot about our emotions, and we've got some neuropsychological theories that maybe are more of a broad brush story than neuropsychological hard fact, let's just say. But in terms of the idea that actually fear is there to keep us safe, that actually this has been hardwired into us from an evolutionary perspective, that we need fear. We need to be able to be to look outside, to hear a rustle in the bushes as we're walking through a dark jungle or savannah, and to think and to sort of have that moment to think, is this rustle in the bushes something that's coming to eat me? Is this something that if I kind of get my spear ready, I'm going to be able to catch dinner for me and my tribe? Or is this something that I need to just run away or freeze and figure out what's going on? This is where our sort of fight or flight and freeze comes from. And so it's functional to experience fear. If we didn't have it, that also causes us large and significant problems. And I think what I think is really interesting, and why actually I personally, as a clinician, I have shifted over from sort of more traditional CBT ways of responding to anxiety and fear, is the idea that actually this isn't something to be necessarily argued with and to put it on a trial in court and find all the evidence for and find all the evidence against and think about, challenge our maladaptive ways of thinking. Because I think I love the way that Act Auntie, who does amazing videos, who's Louise Gardner, who sadly died earlier this year, but her stuff's on YouTube and it's really accessible and brilliant. And she's got a lovely video that talks about the human mind, and it talks about your mind desperately wanting to keep you safe. It's trying to protect you. It's trying to look out for the stuff that could go wrong. And most of the time that's helpful. We have this kind of preternatural ability to stick our arms out when we're about to fall, or grab a child just as they're tipping over, or we've got this ability to do things faster than we can think, which is really, really useful. But it's really difficult when we're in that kind of stress, fight, flight, continual mode, and we're completely on edge, looking out all the time for potential threats, and our threshold has actually got a bit lowered, and everything is feeling like a threat. Everything is feeling dangerous, and our capacity to cope feels minimal. So I can totally see how it can be seen as this is a negative emotion, and I think people's lived experience, and sometimes the conversation you have with people, is, well, I just want to get rid of it. I don't want this in my life anymore. This is too hard. So actually, I think that can be part of the work, is actually, well, how is this helping you, and how is this not helping you? What is it trying to do? And what maybe is the kind of the bundle of emotions. I think Russ Harris talks about the struggle switch, about how when we feel an emotion like anxiety, we then actually wrap around it this other emotion. We might often feel sad. Why am I feeling so anxious? This is really, really hard. My life is really rubbish. Then we might feel anger. This is really unfair. I can't believe I'm still struggling with this. This is terrible. And then we might feel despair or frustration, or this kind of emotion upon emotion upon emotion. And we end up struggling with this big ball. And inside out, I imagine that it'll be round the desk trying to press the different buttons, getting very cross, and it'd be very difficult. But I think Inside Out is really interesting because I think it does try and redeem the character of Fear. Fear gets given a job. When it's Riley's first day of school, Fear is asked, go and make a list of all the things that could go wrong. So she might, I don't know, maybe one of those things on that list is don't forget your lunch money. So Riley might make doubly sure she's got her lunch money, or remember where you're going, what bus stop you get off at. So that's functionally helpful to know, okay, these things could go wrong. I'm going to prepare myself for them. Later on, Fear is in control of the console when Riley's dreaming, and elsewhere in the story, you've got Joy and Sadness trying to get back to headquarters, so they actually interfere with Riley's dreams. But initially, Fear is very competent because Fear is watching the dreams and going, "Oh yes, teeth falling out, seen it all before. Oh yes, I've not got any trousers on. Blah blah blah. I can cope with this." And only gets freaked out when it's something completely novel and is like, what's going on here? I don't know what to make of this. So there is, I think, this redemption of Fear as there's a purpose to Fear. There's something that they've got a job to do. They can do it. Yes, sometimes it can be very difficult when they do that, but they're not just all bad.
Yeah. And yet we do have this toxic positivity, this idea that you must not be anything but happy.
Yes.
And actually, this is something that Russ Harris says as well, is that actually it's the happiness trap. It's really hard to be happy all the time. People aren't happy all the time. And yet that is kind of put forward as that is the goal. The goal is to be permanently happy. And we see that in the film, where Riley's mum's talking to her on the first night in their new house, and through all this confusion, you've stayed our happy girl. If you and I could keep smiling, it would be a big help. Can you do that for him being dad? And it is this kind of like push that she should be happy, and it becomes the struggle, doesn't it? Which is, again, quite an act thing. The struggle of how to stay happy when actually you're not.
Yeah.
And it is okay not to be happy.
Absolutely. And I think it's a narrative that's been spoken over her literally since the first words that she can remember hearing. So the first memory that is encoded is, I can't remember if it's dad or mum, is saying, Riley, you're such a bundle of joy. And I mean, you and I are both parents. We know we and I remember being a kid. I remember hearing stories of my childhood being spoken over me as a tween, as an adolescent, even as an adult. And so we hear these stories being rehearsed, and you can imagine Riley being, "Oh, you're our bundle of joy. You're such a joy-filled kid. You're so goofy, or you're so this, that, and the other." And sometimes these things are really protective. They're really helpful because they can become a helpful part of our self-concept. But if they're too rigid, if they're inflexible, they're unhelpful. And I think that's, again, a big theme in my clinical work, and also that's overspilt into my own life in how I try and manage my own brain and how I try and parent my children, is that awareness of actually how strong those narratives are and how how they speak to us in unhelpful ways, and they can leave us holding on to things and feeling things that actually aren't very helpful, and put a lot of pressure. Because I think for Riley, if she's grown up with that, "Oh, you're a bundle of joy, you're so joyful, you're so happy," how hard is it for Riley then she's 11 at the start of the film, or just turned 11, she's just turned 12 at the end of the film. How hard is it for her to then say, "This sucks, and I'm cross, and I'm sad, and I don't want to be here," which is what she ends up having to say. And the only way she can say it at the end of the film is when Joy lets Sadness take that control and actually let Sadness touch the core memories, tinging them with sadness. They turn blue. And it's you've got all the other emotions going, Sadness doesn't know what to do. How is she going to do it? But Joy has had this epiphany because of what she's learnt in the film. She's moved from she doesn't know what the function of sadness is, to she realizes that sadness was what let mum and her mum and her dad know that Riley needed help. When Riley was struggling, sadness was the bit that she knew. And she also sees sadness comfort Bing Bong, who's this great imaginary character that they meet on their journey. And Joy's like, how did you know what to do? And she's just like trying to blast them with, it'll get better, it'll be fine. And earlier on in the film, when they're doing that fantastic Pixar thing of establishing characters that they do really well in a way that I think is lovely and clear for adults and for small people, is Joy says, oh, there's always a way to turn it around and find the fun. And so that's her modus operandi. She tries to turn everything around and find the fun. And I mean, I'm sure I've certainly experienced in my life, sometimes I need someone to sit next to me and say, that sucks. Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't need someone to find the fun or to try and see the silver lining. It's not going to help me emotionally in that moment or actually move through it.
Yeah, absolutely true. It's interesting you talk about how Pixar introduces the characters. I'm going to segue a little bit here into a little drop of one of my concerns about the film. And it may be because it is actually, I think, such a good film that I'm nitpicking. But anger is very masculine.
Yes.
And I think in some ways the film is rather intrinsically sexist, basically. So joy is this thin, light, airy, bouncy thing. Yep. Sadness is a frumpy, fat thing. And disgust is frankly a mean girl from high school.
Yep.
And then you have at the dinner table, Dad's thinking about sports. Mum tries to get him to parent when she's actually wishing she'd chosen some Brazilian helicopter pilot person. And she has this dignified row of ladies controlling her responses. And the dad has a kind of posse of militaristic. That's not how you pronounce that word. Militaristic command center. And I just kind of look at that and think, was that necessary? Could we not have done a little bit more of a kind of a mix up there? Why does anger have to be masculine? What is that about?
Yeah, I agree with you. I really agree with you. And I think as a society, we struggle with women's anger. We are not socialized to be angry. I remember I used to work in CAMS years ago, and I remember talking to colleagues in CAMS who said, yeah, we see a lot of angry boys and sad, anxious girls. And that was tongue-in-cheek because we did see some angry girls and we did see some sad, anxious boys. But how we express distress, we often express distress in the way that society allows us to express distress. And I absolutely agree. It's interesting. I've been reading some of the blogs and some of the stuff that people from Pixar have written, and they do actually touch on the fact that they recognize that there's a masculine feminine divide here, and the person, I just see anger as a bit more male. Yeah, no surprise. You're a male writer and a male producer. I can't remember whether it was the writer or the producer who said that, but I mean, you look at the Sarah Everard protests. Angry women, we as a society, we don't really know what to do with them. And it's very easy to castigate them and to show them as something different. It's like, calm down, darling, or so much stuff. And it's like, I mean, I've got a boy and a girl in terms of my children. And I want to teach them both to manage anger and to express anger in a way that is good for them psychologically, even if it's not easy necessarily for and to prepare them that they may get pushback on that, because actually, I mean, at the moment, my 3-year-old does not have this problem because she's 3, so she can be angry and obstreperous and actually downright kind of difficult at times, bless her cotton socks, and that's fine because she's 3. But I don't want to shame her for her anger. I don't want to make her feel somehow this is something that isn't of you. You shouldn't have this emotion. This is something that's for the boys, for the men.
Yeah.
Because what we need is we need people who can care about things being fair and things being right, and can go out there and make things more fair and make things more right, because goodness knows that's what this world needs. And it needs men and women to do this.
Yeah.
And for it not to be this kind of polarized viewpoint.
Yeah. And it's just not helpful. It's not a
No.
helpful way of expressing emotions, looking like that. And I also do think it's not fair on men
No.
to be this idea that actually all they're thinking about at the table is sports, and the mother has to get them to be a father. That's
No.
not okay.
No, my husband gets so cross when he watches things like that, or when he has or when people make comments around, I don't know, someone going away or holidays or something. I was like, oh, this must be really hard for Kat, or something like that, from that I'm therefore shouldering all of this parenting. And it's like, well, actually, no, we're co-parenting. And it was really interesting as well when because we had a miscarriage before we had our children, and so many people asked after me, which was obviously massively appropriate. It was my body that had the miscarriage, and lots of our friends were mutual friends. People asking about my mental health, which was obviously very kind, but it was a few people, and mostly people, I must say, who had been through it themselves as a couple, would ask about Doug, because obviously he'd lost a longed for sort of baby yet to be. He was also, and I think it does a disservice to men from this expectation of sports loving, more prone to anger, but also does a disservice of men's sense of loss, of grief, of sadness, and that they are just as able and need to be able to express and sit with those feelings.
Yeah, because actually what we have with the dad's emotions is very much about when to put the foot down, when to take it to the next level. And it's really kind of like a really dualistic parenting. I'm either not doing it at all or I'm taking it to the next level, rather than actually being a rounded person who has, multiple emotions. They just don't seem to be there for the father, which is just a missed opportunity, I think, to potentially have explored that.
Yeah. I mean, it plays to the easy laugh, doesn't it? Because I think we've all been there when we've been trying to hint to somebody, whether it's a partner in a relationship, whether it's a friend, and you're trying to shoot someone's eye, and it goes horribly wrong, because as much as we try and tune into other people's minds, we are not in their mind, so we don't have telepathy, and so sometimes things do go wrong. So I think they play to the easy laugh, but they could have shown either growth, they could have shown difference. I think I do like the way that Dad also, when they're comforting Riley, when because Riley runs away or tries to run away, she shuts down. She literally cannot feel. The desk goes dark because she can't feel, and she's run away, which again, I think is really interesting, that sense of utter numbness that a number of our clients report at times. And when she comes back in and she's able to express her sadness, her being sad allows both her parents talk about things they miss, and they're memories that they have, that they feel sad that they have left. They feel sad of what they've left in the past in their old home life in Minnesota. But yeah, I do think it's a missed opportunity. They could have done more. I think they try and do a little bit there, because Dad isn't just letting his wife, Riley's mother, have that conversation. He's also there supporting. They are being a supportive unit, but they could have done more there.
Yeah. And that takes me on, I think, to the kind of the personality side of things. So you have these 5 islands, and these islands are each powered by a core memory, and one of those is family. And these islands are meant to be what make Riley Riley. So yeah, absolutely. Our minds are relational. That works really nicely. But she has a family island, an honesty island, a hockey island, a friendship island, a goofball island. And I'm like, what? Why did you, what? That's not personality. Your personality isn't made up of hockey or being a goofball. I think I get what they were trying to do, because the idea is that obviously this real structure of mind doesn't involve friendship and family's personality traits as such. we're more likely to be looking at things like agreeableness and neuroticism. And I guess that what they're doing is they're taking that down to a more childlike level. You don't have agreeableness, but perhaps you have goofiness, and you don't necessarily have neuroticism, but you have something else. Maybe she doesn't have that island. So perhaps that's just because she doesn't have a core memory that had led to her being neurotic. I don't know what Neurotic Island would look like. Possibly not a great place. But yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are about that, about the kind of how these islands are powered by a memory. And yeah, it context is lost a little bit in that, obviously.
It is. Yeah, I mean, I think it makes it makes for the good internal world adventure, because this is one of the things they talk about, is that
Yes.
you've got the external plot and you've got the internal plot. What happens to Riley in the human world? What happens in headquarters? Genuinely love that pun. And in the world of the brain. And so they do. There needs to be places they can go for the story to actually work. So I get that. I mean, I wonder, and I know this is my kind of inner act therapist very much coming out here, but I wonder if they'd conceptualized it, instead of islands of personality, they'd conceptualized it as values. And they'd talked about what makes Riley Riley, what's important to value, what do you navigate your life towards? Because then actually family, or kind of connection and family, could be, connection is probably going to be the value rather than family. But again, connection to your family could be one. Goofiness is another great word for playfulness. And that you could quite easily, but I think people are almost more, the idea of personality is something I think we're a bit more familiar with. And I think values-based stuff, I think, is very much in our common parlance from a therapy point of view. And I think it's becoming more something that we're talking about in society. But I also think sometimes we misalign, or we malign rather, values, because we think about values as in like a mission statement that a company may write about how they want to live out their company. But actually, is that what it feels like to the person on the ground in that company? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And so I wonder whether if they'd redone it as values, it could have worked. I think it would have worked better in my brain, but in my brain as a psychologist and a human. But I wonder whether it would have had people kind of going, huh? Because I think it fits for that sense of when she loses these bits, because she's lost part of herself in the real world, so it goes down. So she feels Friendship Island goes down when she Zoom calls an old friend and discovers that there's a new girl on the hockey team and she's really cool and she's really good. And Riley, I mean, it felt almost like that thing, you know, sometimes, I mean, I know you and I used to remember hanging up the phone properly, where the phone went into the cradle, and that satisfaction, if you were pissed off at somebody, of grinding the phone into the cradle to express your outrage. I think hanging up a Zoom call does not have that same point of release. But yeah, then so Friendship Island descent just starts to fall and crack and crumble. So I get why they did it. I think it works very well for the plot of the film. I don't think it's as psychologically helpful. I think values would have been the better way to go.
I think you're 100% right. They are values. They're not personality traits. How did I miss that? So they are. That's just what they are. And there is a problem with that, in that your personality isn't your values. Your values aren't your personality.
No.
But so for people who are unsure what the heck we're talking about when we're talking about values, I think one really good way of sort of having people think about what your values are is the sort of 80th birthday party. So if you were standing at your 80th birthday party and friends, colleagues, family were to get up and to say, you know, what they think of you, what is important about you, what would you want them to be looking at? What kind of things would make you go, yes, yeah, you got me. That is exactly what is important to me. So yeah, as you say, you may have playfulness, you may have compassion, you may have community. These are your values. These are the things that drive you forward. So when you don't know what to do, when you are stuck going, I have no idea what direction to take, it's very helpful to be able to kind of go back and go, okay, well, what would be a values-based action? What would be an action that would lead me towards being the person I want to be?
Absolutely.
And sometimes it can be hard, because sometimes one value conflicts with another. That gets a bit tricky. But that is exactly what Riley has there. She has her hockey island, which is possibly something about her fitness and her health and her sense of a game. Basically, there's a kind of a game element of hockey, not just being fit and healthy, but also being part of that,
Yeah,
being a
community
team.
is what. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think definitely, especially that core memory, she gets lifted up by her team. There was the team and the
Yes.
teammates. It's very aligned, and yeah,
Yeah.
physical mastery, pleasure in that. Yeah,
Yeah. And honesty, that's a value. Connection
yeah.
with the family. They are all values. So when
But
the core memories disappear and she doesn't know which way to go anymore because she's lost sight of what her values are, it
mm,
makes so much more sense than to think of her as losing her personality, I
yeah,
think.
and also her sense of actually, I'm just going to run away. I can't see. I don't know myself. I can't find myself. I'm just going to have to. I'm going to have to go back to Minnesota because I knew everything was better there. Um, it does make me laugh because at the end of, I do love the way Pixar just they throw in these little lines that just make you, you just enjoy them. And so later when everything is better and Riley is 12, she's playing hockey again, they've clearly gone through the kind of the pain of moving. And maybe it's not gone away entirely, but they're in a slightly different place. So Friendship Island gets expanded. Anger really likes the friendly arguments section that has been added. And if you think about those kind of like preteen relationships onwards, friendly arguments is definitely something you learn to do as opposed to your friendship is collapsing because you have disagreed. Tragic vampire romance, Fashion Island and Boy Band Island, which Fear really hopes is a phase. So I'm not quite sure what value might be around tragic vampire romance, but maybe romance, maybe sensuality would be a value that would be in line in that, especially in a kind of preteen exploring of sex and sexuality at that point, would be very appropriate.
Yeah, and I'm sure that is exactly what vampire romance novels are there for. And what's interesting as well, I think, is that we talked before about how when sadness touches a memory, it turns blue. And this is the reason that all of those values disappear, is because the core memories that are attached to those values all fall out, basically. She loses all those core memories. And I like that way, that the idea that Joy doesn't want sadness anywhere near the memories because she will ruin them with her sadness. But memories aren't actually a factual representation of an event. So you have your narrative, you lose memory for detail, and you fill it in with your narrative and your emotions. So memory is imperfect, and absolutely emotions play a part in how we reconstruct our past and how we think of things that have happened to us. So it's absolutely appropriate that sadness will touch them. And what I love is that there's this sense of the film that you actually need to mourn your childhood memories in order to process them. And you grow up by going through your memories of childhood and actually noting the sadness that's inherent in not being that child anymore, not having that anymore. So I think this is kind of necessity to learn that you need to have a variety of emotions, and repressing memories and repressing emotions just isn't going to be helpful in the long term. But I particularly like the way that memory is conceptualized in the film, as well as emotion. These little marbles of memory, that some are just lost in the ether and some are really important and you keep hold of, but emotion plays a part in how you perceive them when they're then played back to you.
Absolutely. And because they do that a lot. They do actually, at the end of the day or at points, they actually pick out a memory and they show them, in that they deliberately show them to Riley to kind of almost remind her of something. And so emotions, that sense of our emotions focusing on something. And I love one of the analogies that I love from ACT that I find really helpful personally, and I use a lot in my clinical work, is the idea of bringing the stage lights up. Which is the idea that our life is like a stage show. There's what we do, what we think, what we feel, the memories. If you imagine I know the good old days when we used to go to the theatre, and you might see like there's something going on in one corner of the stage, but what often happens is our emotion, how we feel about that, is we might there might be a very targeted spotlight on a certain area that might be part of the story. It might be, say, the pain of a breakup, the pain of a loss, or a difficult work experience, and that the spotlight is only showing us part of the story. But actually, if we bring the house lights up, there will be other characters on that stage, other people, other things going on, other facets of our other emotions we're experiencing, other areas of resilience. We are not the sum total of who we are is not what our emotion at that time is telling us to focus on. But sometimes the only way through it, it's not joy. I think if joy had control of the movable spotlight, she'd be yanking it away. She'd be turning it to the happiest possible memory on the stage. Focus on this one, ignore that, ignore that. Whereas actually what needs to happen, and that's what sadness does, because when sadness sorts it out, sadness, when they get the core memories back into the headquarters, sadness touches the desk, which enable, and Riley's parents are actually kind of saying, look, we were so worried about you. What happened? But Riley doesn't speak until sadness touches the core memories. They turn blue. They go into the Tubi core memory collection thing and they start to play. And they're all tinged with blue, which means they're tinged with sadness. Riley watches them. So she watches the kind of greatest hits of her learning to skate, her with her friends, her in her beloved Minnesota. And then finally she can say to her parents, and she says, I know you really want me to be happy, effectively. Also, I know, she says, I know you don't want me to, but I miss home. I miss Minnesota. You need me to be happy, but I want my old friends, my hockey team. I want to go home. Please don't be mad. And that just, I think feeling for my own inner kind of teenager, and also feeling in advance for my kids, that sense of, again, that emotion, that sense of emotion, that emotion isn't allowed. And it's, yeah, the breakthroughs I've had, especially when I'm admittedly working with younger children, when you're like, no, you're allowed to be pissed off about this, or you're allowed to feel worried about this. And when they say it, it's just something about being able to say, this sucks, this is painful, I'm really scared about this. There's this release that comes because we can't move through it unless we sit with it for a while.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the reasons why mindfulness and other approaches have become so huge, is actually that capacity to actually sit with our emotions. We need to learn how to do this. We need to learn how to do it as a society as well as individuals, but there's a function to them, and we can't just whiz past them.
Yeah. Especially in adolescence.
Absolutely.
An emotion regulation change in adolescence that we just can't ignore. So there's a tendency to be very swift in some parts of mental health at labeling this kind of reaction. So Riley has had a huge upheaval at a time of possibly emerging adolescence, and it wouldn't be completely unlikely for somebody to say, well, she has an adjustment disorder, or she's got a major depressive disorder, because that's that numbing, that's the difficulties she's got in coping. But actually, it's all very normal adolescent behavior, especially in the context of a huge house move and moving away from everything. And I think Keltner was one of the other psychologists who was involved in discussing how to set up Inside Out with Pixar, and he talks about how that scientifically a girl at that age is going to start losing joy, and actually that's the phrase he uses in a interview he does. We know a girl Riley's age is going to lose a lot of joy. They're going to feel sad. They're going to lose their sense of self-confidence. They have a drop in self-esteem, and parents have a tendency to be very shocked by that. And in fact, he mentions that, there's that kind of like, oh my goodness, do we need to medicate our child? But actually the film is saying this is normal, this is okay, this is part of growth. And that is so important. One of the most important, for me, messages of the film is that actually we need our children to learn how to cope with their emotions. And
Yes.
they can't do that if we're telling them to keep a stiff upper lip if they're British, or be happy, or show me your smile, or cheer up, or chin up, and all that stuff, that toxic positivity. It's okay to say and to let them know that actually, yeah, you're going to feel a bit crap sometimes, especially as you hit adolescence. That's what your hormones are going to do. Sorry about that. But we're here for you. If you need to talk to us, please don't feel like you need to be the happy little bundle of silliness, goofiness that you were a couple of years ago, because you're not going to be like that when you're an adolescent. You're going to mooch around the house and be monosyllabic and roll your eyes. Disgust takes quite a big role, I think, in adolescence, in my limited experience so far.
Absolutely. And I think they've also in their at the end, as I said, they give you insight into the headquarters of several other characters. So you see the bored kind of 20-something who's in the pizza parlor. You see one of the cool girls, because Riley is mortified at school when she actually cries when the teacher gets her to stand up and kind of introduce herself, and she starts talking about Minnesota, and sadness touches one of the memories, and then she cries in class. And obviously, I mean, I felt for her at that point. Could you imagine anything worse than crying in class on your first day? You will be the kids who cries when they introduce themselves. But there's some cool girls, and at the end they give insight into the headquarters of like this really cool girl who's got this like streak of blue hair. Fun fact, she's wearing the reverse of Sid from Toy Story's Skull t-shirt. Hers is black and white, where his is white and black. It's worth a look. But inside, because often in headquarters, one emotion seems to be like a predominant, almost de facto leader. And inside her emotional headquarters, fear is the de facto leader, center of the board. And they're like, everyone's going to know this is terrible. Why is this so? And there's sadness going, why is adolescence so stressful? And why is being so cool so stressful? Kind of puts her head on the desk. And she's like, she's really struggling emotionally. But outside, she's the center of this little gang of cool kids. And I think we do our young people a massive disservice by saying, yes, or you're going to have the time of your life. No, you're not. Well, not all the time. You might have some amazing moments, some times that you're going to laugh at relatively nothing till you can't even remember what, and you're going to have the best time doing all kinds of crazy stuff. You're also going to have some hard times as well, but actually that's really normal. And there's going to be times when you don't know who you are, you don't know what you want to do, who you want to be, you don't know who your friends are, and you're going to lose sight of stuff. And I think if we do this whole sort of minimize the negative, accentuate the positive, then actually it sets up this sort of false belief that actually to be a functional adolescent, you have to hold it all together, and everybody else is holding it together, because then it feeds into the whole, well, if I was doing it properly, then I'd be able to move on from this. I'd find the joy. I'd turn my frown upside down, as opposed to actually everybody else. And it's really interesting when you talk to people across the age range of that kind of, well, what do you think your classmates, your workmates, your sort of trying to find a peer group, what do you think they would feel about this, or they would say about this? And it's amazing that capacity that we have when we engage our brain in thinking about what somebody else would feel, know, experience, behave in a given situation. We're usually far more able to turn on self-compassion. We're far more able to have a more nuanced appraisal of what the emotions, thoughts, feelings, behaviors might be going on for that other person. And also that capacity to normalize and go, yeah, this is tough. This is hard. They would be finding this hard. They would be scared. They would be worried. As opposed to just when we sometimes what we allow and can see in other people, we often just castigate and censor and reject in ourselves, which is not helpful.
Yeah. And so you have this idea that as she grows, because she's learning all of this, Riley's console should get bigger, and all of the different emotions should take their place on the console, like her mum has.
Yeah.
There is actually a Pixar short. I don't know if you've seen it. It's Riley's First Date? ?
Yes. Hilarious. Love it.
And again, my first takeaway from it was, oh, why did they have to put Dad into that role again? But Mum's going up trying to be cool. So in this really short, basically, a boy comes to the door, and Riley is now 12, 13. And yeah, basically there's a boy at the door, and it's action stations for parents. And, Dad is worried and sits at the table with him, and Mum goes up to try and be cool with Riley. And interestingly, if memory serves, Riley's little emotions in her head haven't changed. But this boy, who must be the same age, has little male emotions in his head, and they're all lounging around and skateboarding and just doing things and not really paying attention to the world around them, while Dad tries to drill down and or be very masculine basically at him. But what I think is interesting is that, for a start, the first thing that strikes me is that Riley's emotions in her head are still mixed, they're male and female. And I don't think the adolescent boy's emotions are both male and female. I think that they're all male. And I wonder, what is that about? Is that because she hasn't quite grown into being female. Maybe it's a puberty thing. Maybe they will all become female. Maybe it's the gender that you associate with. Maybe she's non-binary. I love the idea that you could potentially play with that.
That is really interesting. No, you're right. Because I remember when I watched the As in Inside Out, Inside Out, because you're really struck by the fact that all of Dad's emotions are male and have a moustache, like Dad is male and has a moustache, and they're all and all of Mum's are female and have glasses and have Mum's sort of hairstyle and are fond of cardigans, it seems, and it's I don't know. I mean, they could. I mean, they have said they're not planning to do a sequel. They're not planning to revisit it. I am glad they did the short because I thought that was very funny. I mean, it is interesting what they're saying about puberty there. Whether they are saying that it would change over time, whether it's because actually I wonder a little bit whether they wrote themselves into a bit of a plot hole there, in that they needed to having different genders actually just added to the diversity. If they look different, they're more obviously different, if that makes sense. And then they kind of made a rod for their own back a little bit about it. Was easier to do. Mum and Dad could do Mum and Dad because they're grown adults, and what they did with the boy. Maybe the boy is older. Maybe that is their theory, is actually, or puberty, that's another nice little line that they have of the console when they get the expanded console at the end of Inside Out. They're like, oh look, there's a button here marked puberty. What's that? And someone says, oh no, that's probably nothing very important. And everyone in the audience who is is pubertal or post-pubertal goes, no, that's going to be very important.
Absolutely. So at the beginning of the podcast, we talked about the corporate work that we do with In Mind Consulting. Mm-hmm. And I know one of the things that we hear a lot about in the corporate space when it comes to psychological well-being at work is this term resilience. And I know you and I have had some conversations about this word. And I think that perhaps Inside Out can lend us some ideas about how we talk about or envisage resilience in the workplace. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think it's really helpful. And I wonder if Inside Out if you could almost like Inside Out did corporate training, or perhaps the dad from Inside Out did some kind of corporate training where the idea of resilience, it might look a bit like the inside of Dad's head, where all the emotions are shaded a bit to look like a bit of anger. There's a lot of forcefulness, putting your foot down, just keep pushing through, as a type of coping that I think most people think of when they think of the word resilience. But actually, I think it really depends on how do you conceptualize resilience, because I think understandably there's been a lot of pushback on this term. It's not always experienced as helpful as the answer to people are finding things difficult at work, whether it's companies, individual staff members, teams. The answer, you need to be more resilient, versus actually what pressures are teams, companies, individuals under, what's going on for those people. And I wonder whether actually, if there was this kind of Inside Out does resilience, sort of the bad resilience training, you might imagine that there'd be some kind of anger, joy, disgust, triumvirate of power that focuses on pushing through. They're focusing on turning the smiles upside down, bouncing back harder than before, sadness of fear. Maybe they've been relegated to that circle. They've got to stay out the way. There's no space for them. But I think, as we've said, we need this more nuanced view, because we need these emotions. We need sadness. We need anxiety for all the reasons we've talked about. They have functions. And I think true resilience is about being able to recognize that we're human. As we said earlier, we bring our human emotions into the workplace. They might show up as a reaction to stress. They might show up as we try and live out our values, to try and contribute, show up and work in a way that is actually really important to us. And if we don't recognize this in how we respond to colleagues, in how we manage people, or how we are managed by others, we don't recognize the emotions that are going on for people, we're going to hit problems. Because actually what is going to help people bounce back better are those emotions being seen and recognized and we'd probably say given space to if we were using a psychology term, but actually people understanding what's going on inside people's heads is a massive first step, as you and I have experienced in that work. If you can support people understanding what's going on in somebody else's head, and also understanding maybe what's pushing your own buttons in your own head, where you get pushed into maybe sort of responding in certain ways to certain situations, then that's a fantastic springboard that helps people manage more effectively, work more effectively. And I think it links to a concept that I know we've talked about in the past, about that of psychological safety. Because I think, as for those who may not know, psychological safety, it's the belief that you won't be punished or humiliated if you speak up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And why is this important at work? It's something that's being talked about more and more now, which is brilliant, because actually it's the shared belief that other people on your team are not going to embarrass you, they're not going to reject you or punish you for speaking up. What does that sound like? That sounds like quite a lot of what we see in Inside Out, isn't it? And actually, there's a great quote from this person called Altman, who says that when you have psychological safety in the workplace, people feel comfortable being themselves. They bring their full selves to work and feel okay laying all of themselves on the line. So I think that's we see that in Riley, don't we? At the end, she has to lay herself on the line. If she doesn't, I mean, that's the only way the story gets resolved, is she's run away, she comes back, she's really upset. Well, I know we've already talked about that bit, but she needs to be able to say, I'm not okay, this sucks, can't be your happy little girl anymore. And only when she's able to label it and name it, she can bring herself into that situation, can she then have that lovely connected moment, that hug with her parents that makes it all okay.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's brilliant, and that's a wonderful moment to end on. So thank you so much for coming and joining me today, Kat. And yes, thanks for talking about Inside Out with me, this film which has got so many different facets and we can use in so many different areas of our work. I think this has been really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to Analyse This, Mental Health in Film and TV. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. My guest was Dr. Kat Gardner. We were discussing the film Inside Out. Music by Joseph McDade, and post-production editing by David Woods. Thanks for listening. Please visit me at The Dr. Boo on Facebook and Twitter. Let me know your thoughts. Love to hear your ideas for any future episodes, and your opinions on the episodes we've already done. Spread the word, tell your friends and colleagues about the podcast, and don't forget to subscribe, like, rate and review.